now we're going to do the fun part. We're going to make one of probably the easiest, I think, starter fermentations, even though this was not technically my first fermentation I ever made. It was kombucha, and I actually used to teach kombucha workshops. But sauerkraut's kind of, it's easy, it's pretty cost effective, and it's kind of crazy when you think about, like, if you go to like some of these farmers markets where, you know, there's like a little, like a, maybe like this size jar of sauerkraut costs you like $12, when actually like Cabbage is relatively inexpensive. Cabbage usually is always on, or I think I've never seen it not be on the clean 15. So it's actually a vegetable that you don't necessarily need to buy organic. And yeah, as I said before, like you can actually use, you don't necessarily have to use green. I'm kind of traditional, so I'm using green cabbage, but you can also use red cabbage. It really doesn't matter. And basically the big principle around, and this I didn't really talk about when I first started presenting what fermentation was. So when we think about either industrial fermentation or, you know, fermentation that we're doing for culinary or medicinal, we're usually wanting a specific bacteria to grow. I know I'm not making pickles today, but it's really funny because, like, again, like I've been fermenting a long, long time. I was at an event with some friends, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and they had pickle making, and they had a jar of pre-made brine, or you could do like water and they had add the salt yourself. Fermenter here, I accidentally took the spring water one, didn't add the salt. 2 weeks later, I just had mushy junk that I had to throw out. So the salt basically that we're going to be adding today, and as I said before, that there is a possibility you could do a salt-free version by adding things like, again, whey or kombucha. The salt is basically giving preferential treatment to the lactobacillus, and that's like kind of like the bacteria that we're bacteria strains. There's many different type of lactobacillus, lactobacillus acidophilus, which I think is one of the most famous, plantarum, there's all different, brevis, there's all kinds of lactobacillus. So the salt that we're going to be using today is going to help to produce that, or to give preferential treatment. So what kind of salt to use? So today I'm using sea salt. Really, you can almost use any type of salt except for iodized salt. And the reason you can't use iodized salt is because it prevents fermentation. Though I love iodized salt for a lot of my thyroid patients, I don't recommend using iodized salt for fermenting. So you want to make sure that you read that it's non-iodized, and you know, that's so kosher salt is always non-iodized, and like that's the exception. That's sort of the rule. And most sea salts, though, again, because people, unfortunately, yeah, this even says this salt does not supply iodide, a necessary nutrient. This is perfect. This is exactly what we want. So the basic, so with sauerkraut, the ratio is about 2 teaspoons of salt to 1 pound of cabbage. I don't measure. I'm just like, that's, I'm not a measurer. Once you sort of got into a rhythm, you kind of know sort of like how much to add. And, you know, another big thing is once you've added the salt, and I'll go through that process, you do want to taste it. If it's like extremely salty, you can actually eliminate some of the excess salt by just running it through some water a few times. And one ingredient that you might, so I have the cabbage, and I have the salt. Something that you might see that's missing, that you might be like, huh, is she forgetting something, is water. I'm actually not going to add water because the cabbage is going to do that for me with magic. And you'll start noticing, and I'll talk a little bit about how that magic happens. So again, because I'm unfortunately not a big measurer, I know that this is about, so I'm assuming, you know, I did not weigh this cabbage. My assumption is that this is probably more like a ½ pound. I didn't get a very big head. So this is about, more or less, about a teaspoon of salt. Also, you know, depending on the kind of salt and the coarseness, that could also affect amount. You know, other things you can also add depending on your taste. Like if you're wanting kind of like more of like an Eastern European flair, you could add like caraway seeds. You could add different, if you want, I mean, I would probably, like, if you decide that you want it more yellow and add it to turmeric, which would taste really amazing, by the way. You might want to wear gloves during this. I'm not wearing gloves, but you would definitely want to wear gloves during that because your hands will be yellow. So I'm going to see if I can kind of tilt this. So one of the things you might, probably I should have like kind of got like a ruler because it'll be kind of interesting. So this is actually going to start shrinking. So this full bowl is going to start shrinking. The reason it's going to start shrinking is, so as I said, that the water that we didn't add is going to start coming out. And basically the salt, besides the fact that it produces, or the perfect environment for the lactobacillus, it actually leaches out the water. And now I'm like blanking on, so like, and it all has to do with just the way that the cell, so when you have, so our cells do have salt in them, so do plant cells. And what's happening is the cells are leaching out water so that they're inward, basically just creating homeostasis. So it's basically leaching out the water because the external environment has a higher sodium content than what's inside its cell, and it wants to be just like the external environment. So you can kind of see again, like try to like get this. So basically, we're just massaging the salt. I'm kind of making a mess because this is the only clear glass bowl that I have that you could see, but that's okay. You can kind of see this too. Besides the fact that we've leached out all this water, and we're gonna actually even leach out more eventually. So I'm like going, so right now I'm basically taking a clean glass jar. I always work with glass. You could work with plastic. I just don't. The one thing you don't want to work with is metal, because it could, well, definitely you don't want to store it in metal. I guess would be okay to do this process in a metal bowl, but if you just allowed it to sit, it could rust. You might even see things you might see like pottery or whatever. I'm also a low-tech fermenter. So another thing, if you want to get a little fancy and you want to buy like airlock containers and things, you can definitely buy those on Cultures for Health. I'm just not that kind of fermenter. Here, I'll show you what I've just done. So I filled up this jar mostly to the top. I'm not going to fill up the top, and I'll show you why. So again, this is how I do sauerkraut. You might have somebody else, they might do it a little bit different. And we've leached out most of the water. And like, again, like before if I hadn't put that salt in, I would have never been able to get all this cabbage in the jar. So we're going to put so after we've done that, and again, this is like low-tech fermentation. Some people do get these like fancy airlock things. Again, because as I mentioned before in the beginning of this presentation, we want anaerobic metabolism, so we need to get rid of the oxygen. So you don't have to do this. I do this because I live in New York City, and you can't just have things just sitting about. So I always first apply a layer of like plastic wrap or saran wrap. Yeah, you wouldn't be able to use, I know like, plastic. You wouldn't really be able to use aluminum foil or anything because that would just rust. But the basic idea is, again, like I really just don't want pests in my apartment. So I have to do this. So I've pressed down the plastic, and then I have a little jar that before this I made sure could fit inside. So you want to even actually this could have even worked too, but like basically you want something, a weight that's going to be heavy enough, but then also you want it to be able to kind of whatever mouth size jar that you're using. So I'm just going to put him, oh no, I'm calling him there. Just going to press him down a little bit. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to press, so basically you can kind of see that the water, So this is filled with water. You could also put like, I guess like stones. You could also use like, if you have like a soup can, a full soup can could also work. And then the plastic. And then we're gonna have another piece of plastic. Again, just to make sure that I don't have any invited guests that want to take part of my sauerkraut. So I'm just gonna cover it up. So covering it up twice. So I mean, I'm just gonna put it in here for now just to kind of make a point. So this is how I do it. Whenever I do a ferment, I let it sit out at room temp for 3 days. A big thing is about temperature. So I think there's kind of this misassumption that warm or hot is better. It really isn't always, specifically when it comes to fermenting vegetables, even more so pickles. And when we think about we harvest a lot of cucumbers in the summer, really if you're making pickles, you really don't want it out at room temp, well, whatever that means in New York City in the summer, more than a day, because if you let it sit out and get warm, what is gonna happen once the water turns cloudy, you're gonna get a mushy pickle, and who wants to eat that? So sometimes actually even just doing the whole ferment of a pickle in the refrigerator is actually better. So so I let this sit out for about 3 days, and then I put it in the refrigerator. Depending on how you like things, you could actually start eating it right like after a few days. So my typical thing is I usually sit it out on the counter 3 days, put it in the refrigerator, and I wait 2 weeks. That's my typical fermenting thing. Definitely don't want to just put it on the counter like that, because as I said before, there's still more water in here that's going to be coming up. And then we also have the bacteria. And as you remember, bacteria is going to be producing CO2. And so you might have heard of like this idea of like burping. This is definitely much more if you have like an airlock. I mean, this is going to kind of be self-burping, but it's going to start making noise. Not right now, but in a few days. But I will every day see like a ring of water coming up, because it's going to start bubbling up. But the big thing is you just want to make sure, again, it's not happening right now, but everything needs to be submerged under its own liquid, because again, we're doing anaerobic without oxygen metabolism. Yeah, so that is fermentation, and happy to take some questions.